That February night was as silent as snow. In the tidewater region of Virginia, the cold would sink into your very bones, and on that night, it seemed as though the universe itself had held its breath. Lamps burned in the windows of the big house, but in the slave quarters, there was only darkness, and in that darkness, the rustle of bodies turning on hard pallets. Rebecca Miles, a black woman of 47 years, sat on her knees inside her cabin. In her hand was a slate of stone, and on it, she was writing with a piece of coal. Her face was lined with wrinkles, but in her eyes burned an ember that never died. Outside the cabin, the wind whispered, but inside, there was only the scratch of her stylus against the stone. Near midnight, the bell of the big house rang. Once, then twice, then 3 times. This was no ordinary bell. This was the bell that rang only when something of great importance was happening in the master's house. Rebecca immediately hid the slate in a corner, wrapped herself in her shawl, and went out. Near the back of the big house, close to the kitchen, a few slaves had gathered. Their faces were anxious. Upstairs, in the master's bedroom, there was light and the sound of women's hurried footsteps. "Mrs. Carter's time has come," the cook whispered. "They've sent for the doctor, but the roads are closed because of the snow." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She knew what this night meant. The master's wife, Mrs. Agnes Carter, was a weak and sickly woman. In the past 7 years, she had borne 5 children, and only 2 had survived. This was her 6th pregnancy, and the doctor had already warned that this child could cost her her life. A scream came from upstairs. Then another. Then silence. Rebecca's feet moved of their own accord toward the stairs. She knew she should not go up. She should stay in the quarters and wait. But her legs were no longer her own. She climbed the stairs, walked down the hallway, and reached the door of the master's bedroom. The door was half open. Inside, Master Thomas Carter knelt by his wife's bed, his face wet with tears. On the bed, Mrs. Carter lay lifeless, her face as white as snow. Beside her, a midwife stood holding a newborn baby, a girl, her eyes closed, a white sheet wrapped around her chest. But Rebecca's gaze did not stop at the child. Her gaze was fixed on the other side of the room, where another woman stood. A black woman, her hands bound, a cloth tied over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, and on her belly was a fresh mark, a new wound, as if someone had cut her with a knife. Rebecca took a step back. Her breath quickened. She knew what she was seeing. She knew what had happened that night. But she could not believe it. Master Thomas raised his head and saw Rebecca. There was no shame in his eyes, no guilt. Only a weariness, as if he had just completed a difficult task. "Rebecca," he said in a low voice. "Why are you here?" Rebecca did not answer. She was only looking at the woman with bound hands. She knew this woman. Her name was Lucy, and she was only 19 years old. She had been brought to this plantation 3 years ago, when she was 16. Master Thomas rose slowly. He glanced at his wife's face, then looked at the child, then at Lucy. His voice was perfectly calm, as if he were discussing the weather or the crops. "The doctor could not come," he said. "Mrs. Carter was dying. The baby would not come out. There was no choice." Rebecca looked at Lucy. Tears streamed from Lucy's eyes, but she could make no sound. The cut on her belly was still dripping blood, and her body trembled. Rebecca looked at the child. That newborn girl, her eyes closed, her skin white, her hair golden. She was Mrs. Carter's daughter, or at least, she was supposed to be. But Rebecca knew she was not Mrs. Carter's daughter. She was Lucy's daughter. That night, in that room, when the doctor could not come and Mrs. Carter lay dying, Master Thomas had made a decision. He had cut open Lucy's belly, taken her child, and made that child Mrs. Carter's. And now Lucy stood there, hands bound, mouth gagged, watching her baby, a baby she would never raise. Rebecca's hands began to shake. She wanted to say something, to do something, but her tongue seemed tied. She could only stand and watch, like a spectator. Master Thomas sighed and walked toward the door. He placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Rebecca, you have always been silent," he said. "You have always been wise. I know you will tell no one what happened here tonight." Rebecca gave no answer. She only looked into Lucy's eyes, which were still fixed on her, as if saying, "Remember me. Remember me." And Rebecca remembered. That night, she returned to her cabin, took out that slate of stone, and began to write. She wrote Lucy's name, she wrote the date, and she wrote what had happened that night. She wrote how a mother's child had been snatched from her, and how that child had been made the child of a white mother. This was the first entry. Over the next 30 years, Rebecca Miles recorded every birth, every child born on that plantation, every mother whose child was sold away, every father who never saw his child. She wrote in secret, at night, with coal on stone slates. She buried her slates in the ground, under trees, beneath the floors of cabins. And when she died, those slates remained where they were. No one knew where they were. No one knew what Rebecca Miles had recorded. But this story is not about Rebecca Miles. This story is about the child who was born that night, who was taken away, whose mother was silenced. This is the story of a girl who never knew who she was, and who searched until the end for the secret that Rebecca Miles had hidden in her slate. Margaret Carter, or as she was called on the plantation, Molly, never knew the day she was born. Like the children of slaves, there was no date for her birth, no record. But Rebecca Miles had recorded it, February 14, 1833, midnight. Girl, golden hair, blue eyes. Mother, Lucy, 19 years. Father, unknown, likely Mr. Carter. Child declared daughter of Mrs. Carter. Mother silenced. Molly grew up in the big house. She had her own room, her own clothes, her own dolls. She never had to work in the sun, never knew hunger, never felt the lash. She was Mrs. Carter's daughter, or at least, that's what she was told. But Molly's eyes were blue. Very blue, like the morning sky. And her hair was golden, like corn silk. And her skin was tawny. Not quite white, not quite black. Somewhere in between. When she was small, she didn't think about her skin. But as she grew older, she began to notice. She noticed that the other white women in the big house had skin whiter than hers. She noticed that the slaves had skin darker than hers. And she noticed that when she went out, people stared at her. One day, when she was 7 years old, she went into the kitchen. The cook, an old black woman named Delilah, saw her and smiled. Molly asked her, "Delilah, why is my skin like this?" Delilah looked at her for a moment. Then she lowered her eyes and said, "You are the daughter of the big house, Molly. You are as you should be." Molly asked again, "But my mother's skin is white, her hair is brown. Why is my hair golden?" Delilah gave no answer. She turned to the hearth and silently continued her work. That day, Molly understood something. She understood that her question had no answer, or at least, no answer that could be given to her. As she grew, she saw much more. She saw that the slaves who worked in the fields rose before dawn and worked until after dark, and they never rested. She saw that their clothes were torn, they had no shoes, their children were hungry. She saw that when a slave fell ill, they were left outside, like a sick animal. And she saw that when she went out of the big house, the slaves looked at her. There was no hatred in their eyes, no anger. Only a silent curiosity, as if they were trying to understand her. But there was one woman who never looked at Molly. That woman was Lucy, but Molly did not know her by that name. She knew her only as that woman who always sat near the cabins, silent, eyes fixed on the ground. That woman never spoke. Never. People said her tongue had been cut out, or she had taken a vow of silence, or she was mad. Molly didn't know what was true. But one day, when Molly was 9 years old, she was passing near the cabins. That woman was sitting there, silent as always. Her eyes lifted and met Molly's. For the first time. For a moment, Molly saw something in that woman's eyes. She didn't know what it was: love? Pain? Recognition? But she felt something, her breath stopped. Then the woman rose and went into her cabin. The door closed. Molly stood there, wondering what had just happened. That night, Molly asked her mother, Mrs. Carter, "Mother, who is that woman who lives in the cabins, who never speaks?" Mrs. Carter looked at her for a moment. Something flickered in her eyes, fear? Guilt? But she quickly looked away and said, "She is only a slave, Molly. Do not think about her." But Molly kept thinking. And as she grew older, she thought more and more. This is the story of Margaret. Molly was 12 years old when she first watched the slaves working in the fields. She had seen them before, but this time she truly saw. They were bent over in the sun, their backs breaking, their hands bleeding. The cotton bushes were taller than they were, and they disappeared among them, like people drowning in a sea. That day, the overseer, Mr. Collins, was standing there. He was a tall, thin man with a perpetually serious face. He carried a whip, but he never used it, at least, Molly never saw him use it. But the slaves feared him. When he approached, they bent lower, and their hands moved faster. Molly asked Mr. Collins, "Why do they work so bent over? Doesn't it hurt them?" Mr. Collins looked at her. There was no softness in his eyes, but no harshness either. He was merely stating facts when he said, "Work is work, Miss Molly. If they don't bend, they won't pick the cotton. If they don't pick the cotton, we'll all starve." Molly asked no further questions. But she stood there watching, and she looked at the faces of the slaves. None of them looked at her. They were all bent toward the earth, their eyes lost among the cotton bushes. But there was one girl about Molly's age. Her name was Sarah, and she was tawny like Molly, but her skin was much darker, and her hair was curly. Sarah was picking cotton too, and her hands were very fast. Molly watched her, and for a moment, Sarah raised her head. Their eyes met. Sarah tried to smile, but the smile didn't settle on her face. She bent again and continued working. Molly thought about that day for a long time. She thought about Sarah, and about the woman who never spoke, and about all those people who bent in the sun working while she sat in the big house reading books. That night, she saw Rebecca Miles. Rebecca was sitting outside the big house, washing clothes. Molly went and sat beside her. "Rebecca," she said, "I went to the fields today. I saw the people working. They looked so tired." Rebecca looked at her. In her eyes was that same thing Molly had seen in the other woman's eyes, that thing she could never identify. "Yes, Miss Molly," Rebecca said. "They are tired. They are tired every day." "Why?" Molly asked. "Why do they work every day and never rest?" Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment. Then she looked at Molly and said in a very low voice, "Because they are slaves, Miss Molly. And slaves are those who never rest." Molly heard these words. She understood that Rebecca had told her something, but she didn't know what it was. Molly was 15 years old when her mother, Mrs. Carter, died. She had been weak for some time, and a chill finished her. Molly cried at her mother's death, but there was something missing in her tears. She knew that Mrs. Carter was her mother, but she had never been able to get close to her. There was always a distance between them, a wall that Molly could never cross. After Mrs. Carter's death, Master Thomas grew even more silent. He would sit in his room for hours, staring out the window, saying nothing. Molly would go to him, but he wouldn't even look at her. His eyes were empty, as if nothing was left inside him. One day, Molly asked Rebecca, "Why doesn't my father look at me? Have I done something wrong?" Rebecca looked at her. In her eyes was that same thing, that thing Molly could never understand. "You have done nothing wrong, Miss Molly," Rebecca said. "Your father, he is thinking of many things. Many things you do not know." Molly asked, "What things do I not know?" Rebecca gave no answer. She rose and walked away, and Molly sat there, alone with her questions. That same year, Molly noticed that the woman, the one who never spoke, was ill. She lay in her cabin, coughing, and no one tended to her. Molly said to Rebecca, "That woman is sick." Why hasn't anyone called the doctor? Rebecca looked at her. Her eyes were moist. Doctors don't come for slaves, Miss Molly. Slaves die, and new ones come. Molly heard these words. She could not sleep that night. In the morning, she rose and ran to the cabin. When she opened the door, the woman lay there, but she was dead. Her eyes were open, and on her face was that same look Molly had seen years before, that look that said, "Remember me." Molly closed her eyes. She didn't know who this woman was, but in her heart was a strange pain, as if she had lost something very precious. Later that day, Rebecca called Molly aside. Her voice was very low, barely audible. "Miss Molly," she said. "That woman who died, her name was Lucy. And she was your. Rebecca stopped. Tears stood in her eyes. Molly asked, "She was my what?" Rebecca shook her head. "Nothing, Miss Molly. Nothing. I only wanted to say that she was a good woman. A very good woman." Rebecca left, and Molly stood there. She was certain that Rebecca was hiding something. But she didn't know what it was. Molly was 18 years old when her father, Master Thomas, also died. He fell from his horse one day and never rose again. Molly was now the sole mistress of the big house, or at least, that's what she was told. But the truth was different. After Thomas Carter's death, his debts came to light. The plantation was mortgaged, the crops were poor, and the bank wanted its money. Molly had nothing left, except the slaves. The bank men came and looked at the papers. They said the slaves would have to be sold. Molly objected, but she had no standing. She was only a girl, and the bank men were men with power. The day of the auction came. The slaves were lined up, their hands bound, and people came and looked at them, as if they were cattle. Molly stood watching, tears in her eyes. Sarah, the girl Molly had seen in the fields years ago, was sold. Delilah, the cook, was sold. And many others. Molly watched them all, and in her heart was a pain that never ended. But one person was not sold, Rebecca Miles. She was too old, too weak, and no one bought her. Molly kept her. After the auction, when the plantation was empty and only a few slaves remained, Rebecca called Molly to her cabin. Her voice trembled, and her hands were very weak. "Miss Molly," she said. "I am very old. Very tired. I have something to give you." Rebecca took a stone slate from beneath the floor of her cabin. Then another, then another. These slates were old, stained, but the writing on them was clear. "What is this?" Molly asked. Rebecca looked at her. Tears stood in her eyes, but on her face was a strange peace. "This is the truth, Miss Molly. The truth I have hidden for 30 years. The name of every child born on this plantation, every mother's name, every father's name, if it could be known. And your name too, Miss Molly." Molly picked up the first slate. On it was written, February 14, 1833, midnight. Girl, golden hair, blue eyes. Mother, Lucy, 19 years. Father, unknown, likely Mr. Carter. Child declared daughter of Mrs. Carter. Mother silenced. Molly read this. She read it again. Her hands began to shake, darkness swam before her eyes. This is a lie," she said. "This cannot be true." Rebecca took her hand. Her voice was very soft, very loving. "It is true, Miss Molly. Your mother, your real mother, was that woman who never spoke. Lucy. She was your mother. And that night, when you were born, Mr. Carter took you from her. He silenced her so she could never tell the truth." Molly fell to the ground. Her whole being trembled. The woman she had called mother all these years, she was not her mother. Her real mother was that woman who sat silent in her cabin, who never spoke, in whose eyes was that strange thing Molly could never understand. "I saw her," Molly whispered. "I saw her many times. She looked at me, and I never knew." Rebecca held her. They both wept for a long time. Rebecca did not live long after that night. The slates remained with Molly, and with them a burden that Molly would carry for the rest of her life. Molly now knew who she was. She was not Carter's daughter, she was Lucy's daughter, the daughter of a slave woman whose child had been taken from her. She herself, legally, was a slave, because a child's status followed the mother. Lucy was a slave, so Molly was a slave. She who had once been the mistress of the big house was now herself a slave. But now the plantation was empty. The bank had taken everything, and Molly had nothing left, except Rebecca's slates and a decision. That night, Molly gathered some of her clothes, put Rebecca's slates in a bag, and left the big house. She walked north, on roads she had never seen, toward places she had only read about in books. She walked for many days. At night she slept under trees, by day she passed through fields, sometimes begging bread from a farmer. Her skin was tawny, her hair golden, her eyes blue. People looked at her with wonder, but they never asked questions. One night, she reached a river. She had heard that beyond this river was freedom, the northern states, where there was no slavery. She entered the river. The water was cold as ice, but she kept walking. In her hand were Rebecca's slates, in her heart the memory of her mother, the mother she had never known. She crossed the river. She was free. Many years passed. Molly, now she called herself Margaret, settled in the north. She married, had children, built a new family. But she never forgot where she came from. Rebecca's slates were always with her, in a box, hidden in a cupboard. In 1865, when slavery ended and the war was over, Margaret decided to go back. She wanted to know what had become of that plantation, where the people who had lived there were, and whether flowers bloomed on her mother's grave. When she returned, the plantation was desolate. The big house had burned down, only its walls standing. The slave cabins had collapsed, and grass had grown over them. Margaret stood there, tears in her eyes. She went to where Rebecca's cabin had been. Nothing remained, only rubble and grass. But as she stood there, she saw something glinting in the earth. She bent and looked, and it was another stone slate, perhaps the last one Rebecca had used. On it was written, "My last testament, remember me. Remember all those who were ever forgotten." Margaret picked up the slate and held it to her breast. She knew that Rebecca had not written only for her, she had written for all those who would never be remembered. Margaret returned north, but a part of her soul always remained on that plantation. She preserved Rebecca's slates, and as she grew old, she told her children the stories from those slates, the stories of slaves whose names were never recorded in history, of mothers whose children were taken from them, of fathers who never knew their children. Rebecca Miles's slates may still exist somewhere today, in a museum, in a private collection, or perhaps forgotten in some basement. The names written on them can still be read, if anyone searches. But most people do not search. Most people have forgotten. But Molly, Margaret, she never forgot. And when she grew very old, and her eyes failed her, she would call her grandson and say, "Bring me Rebecca's slates. I will tell you a story, the story of a girl who never knew who she was, and the story of a woman who remembered everyone." And the grandson would sit, and he would listen, and tears would flow from his eyes. Because this story was not only Molly's, it was the story of all those who were ever forgotten.